which used to be a talk about nutrition and cardiovascular mortality, meaning dying of heart disease. And then COVID-19 happened, and one by one, all of our cardiovascular risk factors that I'm going to talk about, it turns out that they are the same risk factors for having a bad outcome with COVID-19. And so I'm going to go through that data just so that everyone's clear that we live in a dual pandemic. And yes, if we were to do the right thing with our lifestyle, the impact of both of them would be markedly diminished. So starting with COVID-19, everyone is really has understood this to be an issue of people who have underlying disease do much worse with COVID-19 than those people who were healthy and younger, for example. But heart disease, diabetes, this was really within the first couple of months, people recognized that those are the people who end up in the ICU on a ventilator and passing away. And then the data started to become even clearer that after a month or so here in Chicago, for example, it wasn't evenly distributed in terms of death. Everybody can get COVID, but not everybody was dying of COVID. And when you look at the Latinx community and the African American community, those were the blips. You saw it terribly in New York as well. And just in the first 4 months, there had been a lot of lives that were lost, and this ratio of African American to white has really not changed. And so it's, what is really driving it? It's risk factors. And so we're saying that really from the beginning that if you're doing plant-based nutrition, you have less obesity, diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease, and therefore you have a better shot of having your immune system fix it. Okay, so then the data started to come out. People were putting all this data together. We did some at Rush. We did, and there are multiple publications all saying the same thing. And that is, you may not know what a hazard ratio is coming into this talk, but you're going to see so many hazard ratios. If something has no relationship to another, it's going to be a 1.0. If there was something that actually is reduced, it would be like less than 1. In this case, 22% reduction would be a 0.78. And so what this is really saying is that if you do all of the modeling, because everyone was saying that blacks were dying faster than whites. Well, it turns out it's not actually true. If you look at a model that includes every kind of risk factor that you can imagine, it turns out that being black was about an 11% protection from dying. The problem wasn't the race, the problem was the risk. And so what we needed to do was take our African American and our Latinx communities and get rid of the risk factors, and then the deaths would go away. And so ultimately, people realized that being black was not associated with a higher death rate. If you adjust for all of the factors that lead to death, it wasn't about being black. Well, I'm going to globalize this for a moment to talk about cardiovascular disease, which is what many of you came here to listen to, and point out the facts that really about 50% of African Americans actually have some form of cardiovascular disease. But it's a blight on our entire country. The amount of money that we spend each year on heart disease, we could wipe out all the student debt and everybody could go, to college for free. There would be no limit to what we could accomplish as a country and a community if we were not saddled with this. And it really is, I'm going to try to convince you that it's a global problem. You can see it all over the world. You can see that people are eating unhealthy diets. Not just in the United States, and numbers saying 11 million people died a few years ago because of what they ate and not doing too much sodium and not enough whole grains. And I wish I had caught you all before breakfast so we can increase the amount of fruits and vegetables that you're eating and lower the animal products. But let me get particular about this heart disease issue. I went into cardiology because of this curve. That is, when I was training in the early 70s, we were starting to see the beginning of all of this stuff going down, bypass surgery. And I was at Emory when Andreas Grunzig came in and started putting balloons inside of arteries. And everyone's heard of someone who's had a stent or someone who's had a angioplasty or bypass surgery. All of these things are amazing. But you know what? You're going to get to a point where you can develop all of these techniques and you're still going to have more heart disease than you have everything else. And it's not that we failed. I wouldn't say a 70% reduction in cardiovascular death in the United States over the last 40 years is a failure. but it really isn't where it didn't get us to where we wanted to go, point A. And point B, in about 2015, the decrease stopped. That is, as inventive as we were, the population and their ability to develop disease really caught up with cardiology. And I really do have patients who come in to see me after a heart attack. And when they're coming in saying, "Doc, give me some pills so I can go back and do the things that got me to your office in the first place." And that's really where we need to change things. And let me just point out, when you look at that curve of going down, 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 and then the down going stops in 2015, same thing's happening in the Black community. Our getting down to a particular death rate is about 11 years later, and it's about a 21% increase in cardiovascular death in the African American community. And so I'm always telling that, I wanted heart disease to be number 2, not with COVID. It did make it to number 2 because of COVID in 2020. But I wanted it to be because our African American population got down to just where everyone else is in the United States, horrifically high, but not 20% worse, and we would have gotten there. But everything that I've talked about so far was really about mopping up the floor instead of turning off the faucet. And so at some point, we have to deal with the cause of the disease, not just really fancy mops. Okay, I have to admit it. We have some fantastic mops in cardiology. Come to Rush, you will find the best mops ever. Okay, and we do stents and angioplasties, and put in valves through the leg, and radio frequency, ablations and cryoablations. We do fantastic things, but we really, as a community, need to focus on preventing the illnesses so that Rush cardiology doesn't have as much to do. This is a problem all around. It was interesting that when Wall Street Journal wanted to talk about this, they really came out and talked about the African American experience, because we are dying at an earlier age than everyone else. And it really is these 4 factors, the same ones that hurt people with COVID: obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and high cholesterol. We have guidelines. It was great to be in the room with these 17 people and try to put guidelines together, and learned a lot from them, try to contribute a whole lot of dietary stuff. But, if people make a choice to smoke, they choose what to eat. They choose whether or not they're going to have their blood pressure monitored and managed. And these are choices that everyone makes every day. What I try to tell my patients is that you're not making, unless you live alone and you're independently wealthy, you are interconnected with other people. You have a family, you have people who, if you have a stroke, they're going to have to take off of their job to go take care of you. So you're impoverishing your entire family, whoever in your community, in your church. The pastor is trying to run around and take care of people in the hospitals, can get overwhelmed. Why don't we take our own responsibility and do pay attention to these 7 things? And if we do that, then that really is, personal responsibility. Okay, I want to talk a little bit. You're going to see me going back and forth because of the interlacing of heart disease and COVID. I'm going to go back and forth between COVID and cardiovascular disease. And one of the studies that was published just last week talked about smoking and weight. And we hadn't focused on the smoking before, but it really does worsen COVID illness, because it does have an underlying lung issue that is really what's taking people out. As everyone knows, you can put someone on a ventilator, you can turn them upside down, so-called proning, and you can make them better, but there's still going to be an extremely high death rate. It's not the 80% that it was in New York and really good places, people dying. At Rush, it was way lower than that. We were down in the single digits for deaths, but that's because we had so many different techniques. But the best thing to do isn't to rely on the fanciness of the hospital that you end up at, but to rely on the fact that you can control whether or not you're overweight, your body mass index more than 30, meaning that you're obese, and whether or not you're smoking. Okay, so focusing on our obesity epidemic, based on that, is something that's happening in the United States. When you look at the data for COVID-19, you get numbers like this: 3.68. Remember that hazard ratio? And I was talking about, 1.2, that's a 20%. Well, 368, that's a 368% increase. This is of having a likelihood of somebody having a really bad outcome if they're overweight, a body mass index of over 25, not even obese at 30, but if you're overweight at all. So the time to lose the weight is now, and hopefully we're at the tail end of this pandemic. The fact that we have so much obesity is why the United States leads the world in COVID deaths. No one talks, well, actually they do talk about it, but they talk about it for a second, and then they move on to the next aspect of the news. But there are multiple, hopefully those of you who are interested in the biochemistry and the immunology will take a screen capture of this slide. But the fact of the matter is that obesity ruins your immune system. And so these unhealthy meals, red meat, unhealthy fats, sugary drinks, and not enough fruits and vegetables. And this has been going on for decades. And this was published just a few days ago. It was very disappointing. We thought that we were getting the message out. I always joke that, I didn't never mind if people don't pay attention to guidelines unless I wrote them. So I take it very personally that people are not actually listening about our message from the American College of Cardiology about fruits and vegetables. And apparently it's really not happening. This publication was very sad, done by the federal government, asking people to just do 2 to 3 cups of vegetables per day. And it turns out that 90% of Americans do not do this. It's just so disappointing. Okay, so what do we get instead? This is our obesity map. So your body mass index, and for those of you who aren't, I'll keep referring to that, the BMI, body mass index, that is your your weight divided by your height in the metric system. And anything above 30 means that you're obese. If you're above 35, you're really obese. And if you look at the number of people who are obese, the darker states, the darker you are, the more obese people you have, more than 35% of the population. That is the kind of thing that you all know if you travel the country, that there are parts of the country that are worse than others. And then you have some places where, a bunch of young executives and going in and out of Congress in DC and people being healthier in Colorado because they're skiing all the time. There are places where it's less, but there are places in sort of Midwest and South where the obesity problem is really bad. Okay, so you've seen this picture, right? I'm going to divide it up ethnically. Okay, so that is much better looking picture. And that's if you look at the non-Hispanic white adults. If you look at the number of dark states, it's just a handful. The number of dark states, if you take in just the Hispanic population, is much higher, 2 to 3 times higher. If you look at the Black population, it's almost the entire country. And so at some point, we have to look at our community, look at what are the things that are contributing to this, and see if we can't do something about it. Why? This is why. I think it's our patriotic duty to do something about this curve. We have a terrible life expectancy. In terms of developed countries on this planet, we have the worst outcomes, and we spend more money than anyone else. And I just hope everyone just stares this and says, I'm going to change this. I'm an American. I'm going to change this. I'm going to be this person who lives like they're in Japan or something. Not going to cost the system very much with my own personal choices. And I'm going to live a long, productive life and see my grandkids graduate from college. These are choices that we make every day with our foods. Okay, and here they are. And I'm not saying it's totally everyone's fault, because there's a marketing issue that we have. And this marketing is very powerful. And if you look at how unhealthy foods are distributed in this country, you are really appalled by it. And then we have a large focus on weight loss and trying to make it better. And you get all these mixed messages. And so the Atkins people, which I'll talk about in a bit, tells you to eat nothing but animal products. And then Dean Ornish, the vegetarian guy, would tell you to eat nothing but vegetables. Well, which one of them works? Yeah, doing plant-based nutrition actually does better sustained weight loss when you look at the same people done in a randomized trial by Bree Turner McGreevy. The plant-based diet is going to be the winner.